Section 33 of the Watergate Report, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Final Report of the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, Volume 3. Section 33, Chapter 11, Individual Views of the Senators of the Select Committee, Part 6. 2. The Government. One of the significant patterns of evidence that emerged from this committee's investigation relates to the operation of government. In the climate of Watergate, there is a tendency to dismiss anything short of crimes. But there is a great value to the facts that follow, not because they contain sensational crimes, but because they confirm a misuse of the intended functions of important institutions. It reflects a departure from legitimate government that, if allowed to persist, would be of far greater significance over time than any short-term criminal event. A. The intelligence community. The attitudes and policies that led to Watergate had a profound impact on the intelligence community, from the FBI and the CIA to the lesser intelligence sections of other agencies. Soon after the new administration took office in 1968, there seems to have been a basic dissatisfaction within the White House as to our existing intelligence capabilities. They were variously considered too timid, too bound by tradition, and generally incapable of acting effectively with respect to what the White House perceived as necessary intelligence. One of the responses by the White House was to set up a plan, an intelligence plan, so that the objectives, methods, and results of the intelligence community would coincide with the White House. This plan was drafted by Tom Charles Houston in early 1970 and came to be known as the 1970 Domestic Intelligence Plan, or the Houston Plan. Much of the plan, which has been described previously, was illegal, either in its objectives or in the methods it proposed. Nevertheless, there are numerous indications, in evidence received by this committee, that the types of activities recommended in the plan were carried out in the following years. The net effect was to subvert or distort the legitimate intelligence functions of the government. The plan recommended an expanded use of electronic surveillance. However, the expanded wiretapping that took place in succeeding years was done outside legitimate channels, such as the 17 so-called Kissinger taps, the tap on Joseph Kraft, the Watergate wiretaps, and even the wiretap on the president's brother. The second element of the plan called for surreptitious entries. Burglaries in fact took place at the office of Dr. Ellsberg's psychiatrist, at the Democratic National Committee, at the office of publisher Hank Greenspun, according to multiple evidence, and were suggested or planned for the offices of the Potomac Associates, the Brookings Institution, and Senator McGovern's campaign headquarters. Mail sent to an affiliate of the Democratic Party was opened and photographed by the U.S. Army in a well-documented and apparently massive operation, and military agents spied on the Concerned Americans in Berlin, a group of McGovern supporters who were officially recognized by the Democratic Party. The specific actions proposed by Houston are only one aspect of the plan. Equally important are the policy recommendations. The heart of this new policy was better coordination and use of existing intelligence from all areas of the government. The means of carrying it out was to be a new intelligence committee sitting above all the agencies. Again, the plan was carried out. On September 17, 1970, an intelligence evaluation committee was set up in the White House. It was to receive information from the CIA, the FBI, and the National Security Agency, and other intelligence sections. Notwithstanding the fact that the statutes prohibit the CIA from participating in any domestic intelligence function, it was called upon to evaluate domestic intelligence gathering by the other agencies when the Intelligence Evaluation Committee was set up. This intelligence was to be digested by the CIA experts and then disseminated for use wherever useful, regardless of the statutory limits placed on the agency that collected the information. What was important about setting up that committee was not the work it actually did, but rather the legitimization of a concept. That concept was that intelligence functions of the various agencies were there for whatever purpose the executive decided it wanted, not for the purposes Congress decided by statute. As an illustration, Mr. McCord testified that he eventually received information for use by CRP from the Internal Security Division of the Justice Department on a daily basis. It included information from the FBI, pertained to individuals, and was of a political as well as non-political nature. This arrangement was made pursuant to a request sent to Mr. Mitchell from Mr. McCord, which led to a call from Assistant Attorney General MaryAnn in which he relayed the Attorney General's approval and told McCord to work through the Internal Security Division. The Internal Security Division of the Justice Department also provided legal assistance to the White House. For example, it provided information regarding demonstrators and information that would embarrass individuals in connection with their relationship with demonstrators and demonstration leaders. Another illustration of misuse of intelligence was the request made to the IRS on July 1, 1969, by Mr. Houston to set up a means of reviewing the operations of ideological organizations. Soon, the IRS had set up an Activists Organizations Committee, collecting intelligence to find out generally about the funds of these organizations. An internal memo pointed out that its activities should be disclosed generally only to those persons who need to know, because of its semi-secretive nature. We do not want the news media to be alerted to what we are attempting to do or how we are operating, because the disclosure of such information might embarrass the administration. The type of organization in which we are interested may be ideological or other. In effect, what we will attempt to do is gather intelligence data on the organizations in which we are interested and to use a strike force concept. This was not tax collection. It was the IRS being converted into an intelligence agency, and it was stopped in the midst of this committee's hearings in mid-1973. The next step was when the IRS began gathering intelligence from other parts of the government, with no attempt made to restrict this to tax-related information. Arrangements were made within the military, the Internal Security Division of the Justice Department, and the Secret Service to turn over information on individuals or groups. So long as the IRS has the power to be a potential harassment for the average citizen if audits are not conducted on an objective basis, this procedure of developing files on dissenting citizens must be questioned. The more important point is that IRS duties and responsibilities are spelled out by the Congress, and such an intelligence operation is not one of them. The IRS and the Justice Department were not the only agencies pressured into assisting White House intelligence demands. A Secret Service agent spied on Senator McGovern when supposedly protecting him during the campaign. When the White House was informed of this, no objection was made. An FBI agent was used by a White House staff member to spy on a Long Island newspaper doing an article on one of the president's friends. The Commerce Department was called on to provide commercial information in a project that it was hoped would embarrass Senator Muskie. The Department of Defense was used to find out information as to Senator McGovern's war records at a time when there were public charges that he may have acted with cowardice. There was testimony to the effect that there was nothing short of a basic policy to use any governmental agencies to seek politically embarrassing information on individuals who were thought to be enemies of the White House. The so-called enemies list was maintained in the White House for this purpose, and a memo was prepared to implement a means of attacking these enemies. Apparently, it was not enough to maneuver the intelligence community and related agency functions. Plans were made to take what is clearly a function of government outside the government, to set up an independent intelligence operation. The first plan was put forth by Mr. Caulfield in proposals to Messrs. Dean, Mitchell, and Ehrlichman. He suggested a private security entity that would be available for White House special projects, thereby insulating the White House from its deeds. It was called Operation Sandwedge. Mr. Caulfield rejected the Sandwedge plan, and it was apparently replaced with an operation that came to be known as the Plumbers. In the meantime, Caulfield began conducting intelligence functions from a position on the White House counsel staff, functions that properly belonged in the agencies, if anywhere. Caulfield was instructed, for example, to develop political intelligence on Senator Kennedy, including instructions from the Assistant Attorney General to obtain certain information about the travels of Mary Jo Kopechne. When he took the job, he told Mr. Ehrlichman that he would hire an ex-New York City policeman to do investigative work. Mr. Ulasewicz was then used to collect information on various enemies, political, ideological, and personal. A sample of his activities reveals not only why intelligence should not be outside the checks of a professional organization, but also the rather broad scope of what the White House was, in fact, doing. His investigations included such things as Richard Nixon's old apartment in New York, a Kennedy official trip to Hawaii, name checks on White House visitors, the president's brother, political contributors to a dozen senators who opposed the administration, Jefferson Hospital in Philadelphia, Lewis Harris polls, the Businessman's Education Fund, the House of Mercy Home for Unwed Mothers, the U.S. Conference of Mayors, a comedian named Dixon, Mrs. Rose Kennedy's secretary, and Birmingham, Alabama City Council, mayor, and executive staff. And that is just a sample of the much larger number of his investigations. Many of them are clearly the responsibility of established agencies, if they are anybody's responsibility at all. Eventually, a semi-official unit, the Plumbers, was established within the White House with a combination of police and intelligence duties. It conducted what Mr. Mitchell referred to in his testimony as the White House horrors. According to Mitchell, these operations were so wrong that if the president had heard about them, he would have lowered the boom, even though there is other evidence that the president did know about them and didn't lower any boom. The legitimate intelligence agencies were used to support this operation, specifically by providing materials for their operations. General Cushman of the CIA testified that after a personal request from Mr. Ehrlichman, CIA technical services people provided Mr. Hunt with a driver's license, Social Security card, wig, and speech-altering device, which were delivered to a safe house of CIA premises per Hunt's instructions. Around August 1971, Hunt began to make additional demands on the CIA. First, for a stenographer to be brought in from Paris, which Cushman and Director Helms considered merely a face-saving move and rejected. Later demands were made for a tape recorder in a typewriter case, a camera in a tobacco pouch, for film development, and for an additional alias and false papers for another man, probably Liddy, which requests came to Cushman's attention after they had been granted by the technical services people. After Hunt's additional demands, and a subsequent request for a New York address and phone services, Cushman and Helms decided Hunt's requests had exceeded his original authority. On August 31, 1971, Hunt made a final request for a credit card, which was denied. Mr. Young of the Plumbers Unit asked the CIA to do a psychological profile of Dr. Ellsberg. It was clearly a domestic project, the only one of its type ever requested, according to General Cushman of the CIA, who also testified that such profiles are reserved for foreign leaders. Nevertheless, it was done, but Mr. Young considered it unsatisfactory, so another profile was prepared and sent. Other projects spanned a broad range, such as spiriting Dita Beard from the East Coast to a Denver hospital, and a subsequent trip to Denver by Hunt in disguise to question her about the ITT affair. To bring the full influence of the White House to bear on this extraordinary activity, Mr. Ehrlichman testified that he personally introduced Messrs. Krogh and Young, who headed up the Plumbers, to the heads of various agencies, such as the Secretary of Defense, the Attorney General, and the Director of the CIA. Members of the Plumbers eventually went on to similar work for the committee to re-elect. Although they were clearly outside the government, they again used the legitimate agencies. Ex-CIA employees were recruited on the basis of their loyalty to the CIA. National security responsibilities were misused. Mr. Barker was even told that the interests of national security he was serving were above the FBI and CIA. To reinforce this position, classified and critical information about the mining of Haiphong Harbor was relayed to Barker the day before the president's announcement. This was not only a misuse of secret Defense Department intelligence, but it also furthered a misuse of national security entrustment in the executive branch. In a different type of situation, Mr. Haldeman was appointed the Lord High Executioner of Leaks. This technique of attacking and solving the leaks problem illustrates the contempt for normal government functions. It resulted in Mr. Caulfield, by his own testimony, being directed by Ehrlichman to wiretap a newsman's phone, Joseph Kraft, in pursuit of a leak, outside the safeguards of government wiretap procedures and regulations. There are capabilities within the legitimate operations of our government for handling such a problem. The attitude that these problems had to be treated independently was the same attitude that led to the 17 Kissinger taps being installed outside normal FBI channels and Margin's instructions from the president regarding the disposition of those wiretap logs that related to newsmen and White House staff suspected of leaking, and that led to unusual and perhaps illegal White House involvement in the Ellsberg case itself. There is a reason for demanding that government officials use only the tested and accountable facilities of government. It has been illustrated by the kinds of projects undertaken independently by the White House. The final contempt for the intelligence community can be seen in efforts to exploit them in the cover-up. Mr. Ehrlichman said that he and Mr. Haldeman had spoken to General Walters and Mr. Helms of the CIA shortly after the Watergate break-in. Ehrlichman further said that Walters was a friend of the White House and was there to give the White House influence over the CIA. Dean testified that Ehrlichman asked him to explore the possible use of the CIA with regard to assisting the Watergate burglars. On June 23, 1972, Mr. Haldeman and Mr. Ehrlichman met with Director Helms and General Cushman of the CIA. According to Director Helms, Haldeman said something to the effect that it had been decided that General Walters was to go talk to FBI Director Gray and inform him that these investigations of the FBI might run into CIA operations in Mexico, and that it might be best if they were tapered off, or something like that. According to General Walters, Haldeman directed Helms to inhibit the FBI investigation on grounds that it would uncover CIA assets in Mexico. Haldeman also indicated he had information the CIA did not have, and that 5 suspects were sufficient. When Director Helms and Director Gray of the FBI scheduled a meeting between themselves on June 28, 1972, Mr. Ehrlichman intervened and canceled the meeting, thus preventing any independent contacts. At a later time, Mr. Dean discussed with General Walters the possibility of using covert CIA funds to pay the Watergate defendants. In February 1973, the CIA was asked by the White House to take custody of Justice Department files on Watergate, but the request was denied. Mr. McCord testified that at the time of the Watergate trial, pressure was brought on himself and other defendants to claim, for purposes of a defense, that Watergate was a CIA operation. The FBI was likewise abused in numerous ways. Some of these, such as turning over Hunt's files to Mr. Gray, have been well documented. But there were other examples. The FBI set up the so-called Kissinger wiretaps outside channels, effectively insulating them from routine discovery and accountability. And at the president's instructions, Mr. William Sullivan, who had supervised the wiretaps, turned over all evidence of them to the White House when it was reportedly related to the president that Hoover might use them to preserve his job. The FBI ran an investigation of CBS newsman Daniel Schorr in what was a White House tactic to embarrass him, according to one witness. Mr. Ehrlichman testified that he was instructed after the Watergate break-in to see to it that the FBI investigation did not uncover the Ellsberg break-in or get into the Pentagon Papers episode. In the end, the wake of Watergate left a distorted intelligence community whose historic professionalism had been badly damaged. End of section 33. Section 34 of the Watergate Report, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Final Report of the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, Volume 3. Chapter 11, Individual Views of Senators of the Select Committee, Part 7. B. Law Enforcement Agencies. The primary responsibility for law enforcement falls to the Department of Justice. To the extent that White House or political considerations interfered with that responsibility, it interfered with a critical part of our government. There was considerable evidence of White House contacts, including pressure and interference, with respect to the Watergate investigation. It began almost immediately after the break-in, with a request to the Attorney General that he try to obtain the release of Mr. McCord. In the following days, he was warned about a too aggressive investigation. He was warned in mid-1972 that Magruder might have to plead the Fifth Amendment. He was asked to provide raw FBI files on the case, and he was asked to be the White House secret contact with this committee. As noted earlier, an agency of the Justice Department, the FBI, was consciously lied to, was asked for raw files, its director was given potentially embarrassing evidence from the safe of one of the Watergate burglars, with instructions he interpreted as a request to destroy that evidence. The White House counsel testified that he, in fact, received information from the Justice Department and the FBI on the Watergate case. Mr. Dean stated that he was asked by Mr. Mitchell, after Mitchell had left CRP, to get FBI 302 reports of interviews with witnesses, and that Mr. Haldeman and Mr. Ehrlichman also thought it would be a good idea to get those reports. Mr. MaryAnn, attorneys O'Brien and Parkinson, and Mr. Richard Moore all viewed those files after Dean obtained them. Dean pleaded guilty to an information charge in October 1973, which charge included a conspiracy based on White House access to those files. There were similar pressures as to the whole Ellsberg matter. When Assistant Attorney General Peterson advised the president of the Ellsberg break-in, he was told, "I know about that," and "You stay out of that." The Antitrust Division of the Justice Department received requests, which have been reviewed earlier as to the media, to go after targets of White House dislike. After the Association of Milk Producers pledged $2 million to the president's campaign, a grand jury investigation of their association was halted by the Attorney General. Nevertheless, antitrust violations were allowed to be pursued as a civil, as opposed to criminal, suit. The antitrust suit was, in fact, brought in February 1972, in spite of much White House concern by Messrs. Colson and Haldeman. The milk producers discussed their antitrust suit with Treasury Secretary Connolly in March 1972, resulting in a call to the Attorney General. Other contacts with the Attorney General were made on behalf of the milk producers, and an attempt was made to give additional contributions in return for dropping the antitrust suit. A similar pattern of efforts to obtain favorable treatment from the Attorney General in an antitrust matter followed the transfer of $100,000 by the Hughes Tool Company to a friend of the president. The Hughes Corporation was involved in antitrust problems relating to pending purchases of a hotel in Las Vegas and an airline corporation. At the time the money was being transferred, a representative of the corporation met with the Attorney General. The antitrust problems were subsequently resolved. The grand jury system, an essential element of the prosecution process, was subverted by members of the administration and CRP, even to the point of special favors for such officials when they were to be called before the grand jury. According to one witness, Mr. Ehrlichman attempted to prevent former Commerce Secretary Stans from appearing before the Watergate grand jury by directing Assistant Attorney General Peterson not to call Stans. Stans' testimony was eventually taken in private, as was the testimony of Messrs. Colson, Kerley, and Young. It should be recalled that the Attorney General doubled as a campaign manager from July 1971 until he resigned in April 1972. When asked if it wasn't improper for the chief law enforcement officer of the United States to be engaging in, directly or indirectly, managing political activities, the Attorney General responded, "I do, Senator." He held this dual role while a number of large campaign contributors, such as the Association of Milk Producers, the Hughes Tool Company, and International Telephone and Telegraph, had important cases under investigation by the Justice Department. The Attorney General who succeeded him pleaded guilty to a charge pertaining to the ITT matter. The prestige of the Attorney General's office was misused. Mr. McCord testified that a very important reason for his participation in the Watergate operation was the fact that the Attorney General himself, Mr. John Mitchell, at his office, had considered and approved the plan, according to Mr. Liddy. Mr. Baldwin was told that if at any time he had trouble establishing his authority for being in a certain place or for having a weapon, he was to mention John Mitchell. In an outrageous insult to our law enforcement institutions, it was in the Attorney General's office on January 27, 1972, and on February 4, 1972, that Liddy's plan was presented, including expensive charts outlining mugging, bugging, burglary, kidnapping, and prostitution. The Justice Department was not alone. Some of the most blatant attempts to pressure an agency charged with enforcing laws were aimed at the IRS. The conversation between the President and Messrs. Dean and Haldeman on September 15, 1972, states this clearly, criticizing the IRS for not being sufficiently responsive to personal and political demands. It is buttressed with evidence that the IRS was contacted in relation to cases involving friends of the White House. The confidential tax return information of Mr. Harold J. Gibbons, Vice President of the Teamsters, was turned over to Mr. Colson. It is significant that the memo discussing Gibbons' taxes points out that he supported Senator McGovern. In fact, he was the only major Teamster official to support McGovern, and the only one whose taxes were apparently sent to the White House. The tax data for a prominent Jewish leader in Rhode Island was given to Mr. Dean's office, along with confidential tax return information on a number of prominent entertainers. Tax audits of Democratic Party Chairman Lawrence O'Brien were sought in an attempt to come up with damaging information. In contrast, IRS contacts were used to help in audits of the president's friends, including actor John Wayne, the Reverend Billy Graham, and Mr. Charles G. Rebozo. A close friend of the president's, according to Mr. Dean, thought he was being harassed by the agents of the Internal Revenue Service. Dean raised this with Mr. Walters, Commissioner of the IRS, who said that could not be the case. Dean kept checking the status of the case because he got questions on it with considerable regularity. Dean stated that it was Rosemary Woods who kept asking me the status of the case because this individual was seeing the president a good deal. The case was referred to the Criminal Division of the Justice Department. Dean was told he had to do something about it, so he eventually saw Mr. Ralph Erickson at the Justice Department, who said, "There is one more thing we can do. There are some weaknesses in the investigation, and we may send it back to the Internal Revenue Service for one last look to see if this follows. It really is a solid case," which to Dean's recollection was done. Nevertheless, the president was not satisfied and suggested that changes be made at the IRS after the 1972 election. In addition, Mr. Dean prepared a briefing paper for Mr. Haldeman with respect to a meeting with the head of the IRS to make the IRS more responsive to the White House. Mr. Strahan testified that Mr. Haldeman discussed a more politically responsive commissioner of the IRS so that it could be used against political opponents, such as Clark Clifford. The IRS was not only contacted with respect to individual cases, it was also the focal point of certain questionable policies. One of these policies was to punish groups, tax-exempt groups in particular, who were thought to hold ideological views different from the White House. There was no evidence that these organizations advocated or did anything illegal or unconstitutional, or that they in any way violated the tax laws. Nevertheless, they were singled out for challenge as to the tax-exempt benefits they enjoyed under the law. Groups enjoying the same benefits who were sympathetic to the administration did not receive the same attack. Use of the Secret Service to spy on Senator McGovern has already been reviewed. The misuse of the CIA and the FBI have likewise been examined earlier. It is quite a record for a law and order administration. C. Regulatory agencies. The regulatory agencies, as much as any other area of government, fit the references in a White House memo which address the general problem of how to use the incumbency and power of the White House against opponents, or how we can use the available federal machinery to screw our political enemies. We have already reviewed numerous misuses of the IRS against political opponents. We have likewise reviewed evidence of plans to make the IRS more responsive to White House problems and demands. A prime example of the distortion of regulatory power is contained in the record of the administration's plans to attack the media. The agency at the center of this plan was the FCC. The Federal Communications Commission licenses radio and television stations and is thereby in a unique position to hurt the networks or any other organization, such as a newspaper that owns a local station. The memos on this subject, which have been reviewed previously, were frightening at best. They demonstrate clear contempt for statutory restraints on the power given to the FCC by Congress. A good sample of the attitude towards agencies is a memo from Mr. Jeb Magruder to Mr. Ken Reitz, which notes that Action, the agency that coordinates government volunteer programs, is an agency that we should be able to use politically. The memo recommends a meeting with Action's director to discuss how we use their recruiters, who talked to 450,000 young people last year, advertising program, public relations effort, and public contact people to sell the president and the accomplishments of the administration. We should be involved and aware of everything, from the scheduled appearances of Action's recruiters to the format and content of its advertising. D. The departments. The variety and scope of evidence bearing on the functions of the departments stretches all the way from fabricating a false historical record of the State Department in the Vietnam War to using the Department of Interior to punish a newscaster. The State Department incident shows the extremes that were followed to achieve the political ends of the White House. In apparent anticipation that Senator Kennedy would be the opposing nominee for the presidency, an attempt was made to falsify President Kennedy's role in the assassination of President Diem early in the Vietnam War. The strategy used to implicate President Kennedy in Diem's death was to make up phony telegrams between the White House and South Vietnam during that critical period. One particular telegram indicated that Kennedy did not offer safe refuge to Diem, thereby ensuring his assassination. To be able to do this, the State Department was contacted by Mr. Young of the White House Plumbers, resulting in Hunt's authorization to go over and review the appropriate cables between the United States and Saigon. Arrangements were made to leak the story to appropriate newspersons. When Hunt's safe was opened on June 20, 1972, the bulk of the papers, according to testimony, were classified cables from the State Department relating to the early years of the Vietnam War. The Department of Commerce was more directly used. The Secretary of Commerce attended meetings on campaign matters and campaign contributions while still in office. In order to put out a story demonstrating that help provided to the Maine sugar beet industry by Senator Muskie was going to cost taxpayers $13 million in defaults by that industry, the Department of Commerce was requested to provide the research material for that story. The correspondence flowed between the White House and Commerce until the White House feared that their respective roles might be discovered. Because of a rather hostile comment former newscaster Chet Huntley once made regarding the president, there was an effort to make it as difficult as possible for him to get his Big Sky project in Montana moving. Apparently, Huntley needed assistance from the Interior Department, which was periodically contacted by the White House in this regard. For whatever reason, Huntley eventually agreed to back the president in the 1972 campaign, and the attack was called off. The Department of Agriculture announced on March 12, 1971, that price supports for milk would not be increased. Board members of the Commodity Credit Corporation, which has responsibility for clearing such a decision, was unanimous in its recommendation not to increase supports. On March 25, 1971, the president reversed the decision of the Agriculture Department. There is much evidence of White House awareness and attention at that time to a $2 million campaign pledge by the milk producers. Whether or not the president's decision was the result of a dairy industry bribe it is important to note that the legitimate functions of the Agriculture Department were circumvented and interfered with. In the reversal process, none of the assistant secretaries at Agriculture or their staffs were consulted. These were the professionals who had the expertise, who knew the reasons for the initial decision, who would have to enforce and live with the new decision by the President. Their opinion or expertise as to the President's reversal was never given. It was never solicited, even indirectly. Instead, at 10:30 a.m. on March 23, 1971, the President met with the milk producers saying, "I know, too, that you are a group that are politically very conscious, and you are willing to do something about it." After a flurry of meetings between other administration officials and milk producers' representatives, the President changed the Department of Agriculture's position on March 25, 1971. Thus, regardless of other issues involved, the acceptable processes of government were evaded for apparently personal and political interests. A memo was presented which revealed a cabinet session in which Mr. Fred Malek told the assembled cabinet members of a plan to make the departments more responsive to the political needs of the administration. It was this program that led to some of the more unique abuses of the departments and agencies. It was this program that led to evidence of quid pro quos for the contracts from the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Department of Labor, the Department of Interior, the Office of Economic Opportunity, the Office of Minority Business Enterprise, the Federal Home Loan Mortgage Association, the General Services Administration, Action, and the Veterans Administration. For example, a June 3, 1971 White House memo noted that the head of the Federal Home Loan Bank Board has given a great deal of thought to and designed a sound economical plan to use federal resources, projects, contracts, etc., for advantage in 1972. A June 23, 1971 White House memo recommended that, in addition to designating must grants from pending applications, there may be occasions in which political circumstances require a grant be generated for a locality. This, of course, is in direct contravention of equal treatment under the laws that control federal awards, which are supported by taxpayer funds and are to be distributed only on the basis of merit and need by law. By March 1972, this program, according to a memo to Mr. Haldeman, citing success at the Commerce Department as an example, had resulted in favorable grant decisions which otherwise would not have been made, involving roughly $1 million. It was then recommended that someone was needed to take the lead in the program to politicize the departments and agencies, and closely monitor the grantsmanship project to ensure maximum and unrelenting efforts. A December 23, 1971 memo to Mr. Haldeman noted that this program, even if done discreetly, will represent a substantial risk. Trying to pressure non-political civil servants to partisanly support the president's reelection would become quickly publicized and undoubtedly backfire. Consequently, the strategy should be to work through the top and medium-level political appointees who exercise control over most of the departmental decisions and actions. By June 1972, Mr. Malek reported that he had reviewed the program with each cabinet officer, except Rogers, and with the heads of the key agencies, and had them name a top official who would be the political contact for this program, as well as educate loyal appointees, thus forming a political network in each department. Aside from abuse of the laws which authorize federal grants, there are numerous indications that this program violated the Hatch Act. That act specifically protects against politicizing the government and makes such efforts criminally illegal. In addition, much of this conduct may have involved a conspiracy to defraud the United States under the criminal laws of Title 18, United States Code, Section 371, as well as criminal violations of at least 3 sections of the campaign laws. So much for our independent departments and agencies. The executive department diverted a substantial portion of its payroll, privileges, and power into non-governmental activities. Mr. Frederick Malek, for example, held an official position at the Committee to Re-elect the President as of June 1972, while on the White House payroll until September 1, 1972. Mr. Gordon Strahan likewise was employed as a liaison to CRP while being paid as an assistant to the White House Chief of Staff. Political advertising was supervised from the office that was supposed to be the White House Chief of Staff. Mr. McCord testified that he took part in Watergate partly because the top legal officer in the White House had participated in the decision to undertake the operation. The prerogatives granted the executive were misused, as has been detailed earlier. The effect is well summed up by Mr. McCord's testimony that he was told the President of the United States was aware of the meetings offering him payoffs and clemency, that the results of the meetings would be conveyed to the President, and that at a future meeting there would likely be a personal message from the President himself. This supplemented threats that the President's ability to govern is at stake, and the government may fall if Mr. McCord did not follow the game plan. Mr. Caulfield confirmed that when he met with Mr. Dean, that Dean wanted to transmit the message to McCord that the offer of executive clemency was made with the proper authority, and that he made such representation to McCord. Not only were the department functions abused, but the executive power of appointing department officials was likewise used. It was Herbert Porter who testified that he reminded the White House of the things he had done in the campaign when they dragged a bit in finding him a new job after the election. It was Jeb Magruder who was awarded with a high-ranking job at the Commerce Department for his misdeeds in the re-election campaign. These examples are minor compared to the general plans that were discussed to restaff the departments after the election to make them more subservient to the White House. As a final, rather tragic note, this is the White House that used its power over department appointments to nominate Mr. Gray to the FBI directorship, decided not to support him any longer, and rather than tell him of that fact, decided to let him hang there and twist slowly, slowly in the wind. End of section 34.
Section 35 of The Watergate Report, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Greg Giordano. Final report of the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, Volume 3, Chapter 11, Individual Views of Senators of the Select Committee, Part 8. 3. The Political System. Watergate challenged the very underpinnings of American politics and the American political condition. It happened in a natural clash and confusion of a free and open system of self-government, the same condition that despite its risks and vulnerability has given us many more moments of magnificence. Nevertheless, whenever the nation approaches a presidential election year, we have especially good reason to recall our founding fathers' warnings against the, quote, danger of factions, end quote. History teaches us that no matter how much a president may insist otherwise, an incumbent begins to measure policy decisions by their effect on his re-election and wields power in pursuit of his most advantageous position. The system is designed to absorb this, but without question there is a line that cannot be crossed if the process is not to be abused. The best way to observe how this happened to our political system in 1972 is to examine it in three component parts: the political party, the electoral process, and the democratic system. A. The political party. Political parties in America have their own life and status. They were expressly excluded from our Constitution, yet they have persisted since the nation's first generation. The party has come to serve as a link between constituencies and men chosen to govern. They serve a valuable function, drawing competitive forces together to seek the reconciliation so essential to intense issues. When the parties do not function well, individual citizens feel a loss of control over politics and government. they find themselves powerless to influence events. Voting seems futile. Politics seems pointless. The political process crosses the line, and things go badly for America. By any measure, the process that led to Watergate emasculated important party functions. It began with the decision to take the party's leader and his re-election out of the Republican Party and into an independent entity, unresponsive to the checks and balances of party politics. From that point on, the committee to re-elect the president was a political disaster. There was a rationalization of CRP's existence in some testimony to the effect that it was needed for the primaries. Footnote: Mr. Odle justified the need for CRP because the president was but a candidate for nomination prior to the convention, though, according to Odle, there was little doubt the president would triumph. There was a distinct possibility of a challenge from Congressman Ashbrook and Congressman McCluskey. Odle felt it was not proper for the National Committee to work for President Nixon, with 2 challengers anticipated. 1 Hearings 23. End of footnote. A number of Republican candidates entered the primaries, and it was considered unfair to use the Republican National Committee on behalf of the president. This theory ignored the president's massive popularity in the party at the time. The fact is that CRP remained in operation throughout the campaign, long after it would have been proper for the Republican Party to take over. Significantly, all available evidence indicates that the traditional party organizations at the national level, the Republican and Democratic National Committees, did not undertake illegal or improper activities in the 1972 campaign. After 16 months of investigation, the staff of this committee reported conclusively that there was no evidence of wrongdoing, directly or indirectly, by the Republican National Committee or its chairman, Senator Robert Dole, Republican of Kansas, during the 1972 campaigns. Evidence as to CRP's operation is in direct contrast. By setting up an exclusive organization concerned only with the president, the party was excluded from being properly aided by its titular head. The president was well financed, and he won in a landslide. The Republican candidates for Congress and state offices did not have similar success in financing and campaigning against their Democratic opponents. A good example of the tactics that hurt the party was the list of 100 Democratic senators and congressmen, quote, primarily from the South, who had supported the president on the crucial votes on the Vietnam War, end quote, who would, quote, not receive very strong opposition, end quote, from the White House. Clearly, this would not have been possible if the party had been involved in the president's campaign. Not only did the White House undermine the Republican Party by supporting Democratic candidates, it likewise undermined the party from within by attacking Republican candidates. A memo from Mr. Haldeman in October 1969 outlined a letter-writing campaign to silence Republican Senators Percy, Goodell, and Mathias. It consisted of, quote, sending letters and telegrams and making telephone calls to the senators, blasting them, end quote. A few days later, it was reported to Haldeman that local groups in Illinois had begun sending critical telegrams and letters to Senator Percy. A handwritten note by Mr. Haldeman disclosed, quote, this was an order, I was told, is being carried out, and so informed the president. Incredible as it may seem, the party was writing letters to itself. Leaders of the Republican Party were being attacked by the head of their own party in disguise. End quote. An incident of serious significance was the suggestion by Mr. Patrick Buchanan that the Florida Republican State Chairman and the U.S. Attorney General attempt to use a provision in Florida law to keep a Republican challenger off the primary ballot, not because of legal considerations, but for political advantage. Earlier, that same challenger had been subjected to a bogus contribution to his New Hampshire campaign in the name of the Young Socialist Alliance, staged by Mr. Colson and leaked to the press to discredit his candidacy. Footnote: Herbert Porter called Roger Stone and suggested that Stone travel to New Hampshire and contribute money to McCluskey's campaign under the name of an extremist group. Staff interview with Roger Stone, pages 2 through 3. End of footnote. Again, a fellow Republican. Negative politics were even taught to the young. Mr. Ken Reitz organized the young voters for the president as part of CRP and designed projects for them, such as the McGovern-Shriver Confrontation Project. This project used the young voters to confront Democratic candidates to generate adverse press and, quote, upset the candidate, end quote. Footnote: in a September 22, 1972 progress report, Ken Reitz, director of Young Voters for the President, cited daily orchestrated demonstrations using YVP personnel to confront candidates McGovern and Shriver in an attempt to generate adverse press coverage. Memo from Ken Reitz to Jeb Magruder, September 22, 1972. End of footnote. The result was that by September 1972, they had, quote, learned the McGovern organization and or the Secret Service has reacted to our activities. The street walk was canceled, and McGovern spoke in an area that was barricaded off, end quote. The committee to re-elect the president violated the principles of good politics, beginning with its structure and staffing. The separation between partisan politics and government was violated by the participation of White House staff, as well as department and agency officials, in the campaign operation of CRP. Testimony as to the structure was to the effect that, quote, people who were at the White House had influence over the committee. They gave it direction. They assisted it, end quote, and that the campaign director, quote, came from the Justice Department, end quote. The role of the assistant to the White House Chief of Staff, quote, was to try to find out all of the things that were going on at the committee and make Mr. Haldeman aware of them, end quote. Mr. Fred Malek, according to the individual in charge of personnel at CRP, became head of the Citizens Division of CRP between March and June 1972, exercising supervisory control, and had an office at CRP, even though he did not leave the White House staff or payroll until September 1, 1972. Mr. Mitchell at the Justice Department and Mr. Haldeman at the White House, quote, jointly made decisions in advertising, end quote. In citing instances of so-called blame-taking, one witness cited an example when Mr. Colson took the blame for ads of questionable political ethics, whereas Mr. Haldeman was actually responsible. Campaign recommendations from CRP were sent to the Attorney General for his decision as early as July 3, 1971. That particular campaign memo was written by a staff member in Mr. Malek's White House office, with the assistance of an individual in the Office of Management and Budget and an individual in Mr. Harry Dent's White House office. Footnote: Memo on grantsmanship, dated July 3, 1971, from Magruder, CRP. It states, quote, enclosed is a copy of a proposal to ensure that the President and his congressional supporters get proper credit for federal government programs. This proposal was written by Bill Horton in Fred Malek's office with the assistance of Bill Gifford, OMB, and Peter Milsau to Harry Dent's office. If implemented, this should be an effective method of ensuring that political considerations are taken into account. End quote. Odle testified that these types of memos were sent to the Attorney General from May 1, 1971 onward. Exhibit 1, 1 Hearings 449. End of footnote. Mr. Mitchell himself testified that, quote, he had frequent meetings with individuals from CRP dealing with matters of policy, end quote, and staffing of CRP while he was still Attorney General. Footnote. Mitchell testified that he, quote, had frequent meetings with individuals from CRP dealing with matters of policy, end quote, and staffing at CRP while he was still Attorney General, even though in a colloquy with Senator Kennedy during the Kleindienst confirmation hearings, which was entered into the record, Mitchell had testified that at that time He did not have any re-election campaign responsibilities. Exhibits 74 and 75 consist of a number of documents wherein Mitchell was, quote, exercising his responsibilities as director of the campaign, end quote, in June 1971 and January 1972, while still Attorney General. 4 hearings, 1653 through 55. End of footnote. The hiring of personnel for the committee was, quote, cleared by Mr. Magruder, CRP, Mr. Mitchell, Justice Department, and Mr. Strachan, who would be looking out for Mr. Haldeman's White House interest in the clearance process. End quote. The assistant to Mr. Haldeman was even well briefed on the Liddy plan long before the break-in, and in fact was called on June 17, 1972, to alert him to the pending break-in. Footnote. In his regular political matters memo to H.R. Haldeman, Strachan wrote, quote, Magruder reports that 1701 now has a sophisticated political intelligence gathering system with a budget of $300. A sample of the type of information they are developing is attached at tab H. End quote. Testimony of Gordon Strachan, 6 hearings, 2441. End of footnote. The temptation and opportunity to abuse executive power thus existed, and the fact that such abuses took place has been demonstrated earlier in this report. For example, the use of government agencies to seek politically embarrassing information on individuals who were thought to be enemies of the White House, which was testified to repeatedly, was certainly facilitated by the presence of White House and agency staff within a non-party campaign committee. These tactics extended beyond the departments and agencies. Mr. McCord testified to phone calls and personal contacts to the effect that there would be executive clemency, financial support for the families, and rehabilitation after prison. This was possible only through the facilities of the presidency. Little, if any of it, could have been offered by a political party. A second aspect of staffing that caused problems, and that could have been avoided by using the Republican Party, was the use of personnel that had little or no experience in elective politics. The danger of such a staff can be illustrated in the intelligence gathering area. Candidates and campaign organizations have collected intelligence for generations. In the past, however, there has been something akin to an unwritten code as to the methods and content of information sought. It is interesting to contrast Mr. Ehrlichman's description of discrete investigations as intended to develop questionable facets of the personal lives of those being investigated, checking into domestic problems, drinking habits, personal social activities, and sexual habits. Somehow Mr. Ehrlichman tried to make a connection between the type of undercover prying into private lives of Ulasewicz and his, quote, own knowledge, end quote, of members of Congress who, quote, totter onto the floor in a condition of at least partial inebriation, end quote. Not only did Ulasewicz not investigate the behavior of officials while performing their public responsibilities, but Mr. Ehrlichman offered no evidence to substantiate his, quote, own knowledge, end quote. When Mr. Ehrlichman then testified that it was proper to have ad hoc investigators going into sexual habits, drinking habits, domestic problems, and personal social activities, and then provide that information to the electorate, this senator responded, quote, you definitely have two different concepts of politics in this country meeting head-on, end quote. Significantly, the American people passed judgment on this issue shortly thereafter. A Harris poll exactly 2 months later reported, quote, by 83 to 8%, the public is massively critical about the hiring of private detectives by the White House to spy on the sex life, drinking habits, and family problems of political opponents, end quote. Whether caused by a lack of experience or by a lack of proper leadership, the staff of CRP had a tragic history. One employee recalled that, quote, when you find that a person you trust and respect is in jail for doing something and that man worked for you, it is quite a serious thing, end quote. It was summed up by Mr. Robert Odle, who testified that during his association with the committee, he came in contact with more than 400 of its national staff, and, quote, it now appears tragically that some of those people have acted unethically, end quote. Indeed, At the time he testified on May 17, 1973, the opening day of hearings, 2 former members of the staff had been convicted of crimes. Footnote: James McCord and Gordon Liddy. This refers only to employees of CRP. End of footnote. To date, in mid-1974, 7 former members have been indicted for or convicted of criminal conduct. Footnote: James McCord, Gordon Liddy, Jeb Magruder, John Mitchell, Herbert Porter, Robert MaryAnn, and Fred LaRue. This again refers only to employees of CRP. End of footnote. This is not what politics should be or has been about. The second area in which CRP took over normal party functions was campaign financing. Money was not properly raised. Instead, it was allegedly raised by Mr. Rebozo, a friend of the president, who had no official campaign responsibility. Money was raised by the president's personal attorney. During the 1970 campaigns, he was directed on 3 separate occasions by the White House staff to disperse funds from a trust fund in his control at the Chase Manhattan Bank in New York. He successfully took $100,000, $200,000, and $100,000 from a safe deposit box, on which one of the signatories was a family relation of the White House Chief of Staff. Footnote: Mr. Kalmbach delivered these funds left over from the 1968 campaign to a man he did not know, but could identify by means of clandestine signals at the Sherry Netherlands Hotel in New York. Testimony of Herbert Kalmbach, 5 hearings, 2342-44. End of footnote. The beginnings of the administration's relationship with the Milk Producers Association, according to their testimony, was a $100,000 contribution to the president's attorney to gain access to the White House and to lay the groundwork for favorable treatment in certain specified ways for the milk producers and the dairy industry. Footnote: Mr. Kalmbach understood the $100,000 contribution from AMPI in 1969 to be tied to access to the president and administration approval of new price supports for dairy farmers. Affidavit of Herbert Kalmbach to the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, Supra. End of footnote. Messrs. Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and Colson, all of whom were senior White House advisors, held meetings to discuss fundraising, including the $2 million pledge from the milk producers. Money was raised by a Secretary of Commerce and a Secretary of the Treasury, all of which would have been unnecessary if financing had been left to the professionals in the Republican Party. The handling of money was equally bad. Large amounts of cash were transferred and used. Secret funds were set up. Financial records were destroyed on a number of occasions. People with no campaign responsibility were receiving and distributing money. Illegal corporate contributions were given to CRP and accepted. Even though CRP represented itself as a presidential re-election organization, it gave $25,000 to a congressional campaign in Maryland. It gave $50,000 to a vice presidential donor in Maryland to make it appear that a vice presidential fundraising event was more successful than it was, in what turned out to be an illegal transaction. Mr. McCord's salary from the committee was continued from July 1972 through January 1973. One witness understood that in Governor Wallace's gubernatorial campaign in Alabama, Mr. Kalmbach provided Wallace's opponent with between $200,000 and $400,000. The intelligence activities of CRP were the greatest distortion of the political system undertaken by that committee. The Republican Party had an information gathering function of a research nature, but it was considered inadequate by the White House, which had become used to the sophisticated technique of law enforcement, national security, and government intelligence. Unfortunately, by combining systems, they weren't able to draw the distinction between law enforcement and politics. As a result, CRP found itself collecting and using secret intelligence from the FBI and the Internal Security Division of Justice. They developed a security unit that burglarized, photographed, and wiretapped, that staked out senators' and congressmen's offices and cased the Democratic headquarters. Footnote: This refers to the White House plumbers. 3 hearings, 919-924, the surveillance of Alfred Baldwin, first hearings 396-397, and the aborted attempt of the Liddy McCord team to break into McGovern headquarters, as well as the successful Watergate break-ins, first hearings 125-247. End of footnote. They planned illegal acts against the Democratic Party chairman at his residence and subsequently at his office. Similar plans were made for Senator McGovern's headquarters in Washington and at the Democratic Convention. Electronic surveillance of Senator Muskie's campaign office was discussed as a future target, according to McCord, but instead an office in an adjacent building was leased under the false name of John B. Hayes. Transcripts of illegally wiretapped phone calls were available to the committee to re-elect. The person transcribing the wiretaps was paid by payroll check from the committee. A secretary on the CRP payroll typed up illegal wiretap transcripts, assisted Mr. Liddy in preparing a pass to enter McGovern headquarters, and eventually took part in the shredding of illegal intelligence documents. CRP built a capability to intercept and photograph memos in the Muskie campaign. It infiltrated not only Muskie's campaign, but McGovern's suite at the Democratic Convention and Senator Humphrey's campaign with an infiltrator known as Sedan Chair. CRP became a group that had a .38 snub-nosed Smith & Wesson revolver in its files that it handed out to one of its spies, that was purchasing spy equipment from bugging equipment to microfilm machines for viewing its stolen documents, that was falsifying credentials and shredding incriminating documents. Expensive charts were purchased to display plans for bugging, mugging, burglaries, and the like to the Attorney General. After that briefing, Liddy reported that Mr. Dean had asked him to destroy them, but because the charts were so expensive, Liddy decided not to. It found itself with an arrangement for two attorneys, Mr. Caddy and Mr. Rafferty, to appear at the 2nd Precinct following the Watergate arrests when the participants did not return home from their night's work. At one point, the committee was even instructed by the White House to hire a shaggy person to sit in front of the White House wearing a McGovern button. This could only be matched by the hiring of counter-demonstrators for the funeral of J. Edgar Hoover, hardly a political event. The committee to re-elect the president not only undermined the National Republican Party, the proper functioning of the Democratic Party was likewise subverted. The intelligence functions previously described were designed, among other things, to influence the choice of the Democratic nominee for president. As part of that tactic, the illegal or unethical capabilities that were set up were consistently focused on the strongest contender. The early attack was against Senator Kennedy. It shifted to Senator Muskie. As Muskie's strength diminished, instructions came from the White House to shift the attack to Senator McGovern. This included not just intelligence, but the so-called dirty tricks operation as well. The attempts to undermine the Democratic Party went beyond the candidates. A memo entitled Counter-Actions and dated September 11, 1972, noted that depositions could be taken in a civil suit against Larry O'Brien, covering, quote, everything from Larry O'Brien's sources of income while chairman of the DNC to certain sexual activities of employees of the DNC. They should cause considerable problems for those being deposed. Mr. Dean recalled Mr. Haldeman's telling him that he hoped O'Brien would be McGovern's campaign manager, quote, because we have some really good information on him. Dean believed that he was referring to tax information at that time. End quote. B. The electoral process. A whole range of activities during the 1972 campaign, including so-called dirty tricks, were aimed at the voter. To the extent that improper or illegal methods were used to influence votes, they interfered with the electoral process. The task of influencing the final vote for president had its beginnings early in the campaign process. It was a complex operation, not simply questionable tactics to get people to vote for Mr. Nixon. Rather, its thrust was negative, to get people to vote against strong contenders. To take away votes from Senator Muskie in New Hampshire, Mr. Colson, stating that he had the president's approval, drafted a letter urging a write-in campaign for Senator Kennedy. Between 150,000 and 180,000 of the letters were sent out. A press conference was staged in support of the bogus campaign, along with appropriate advertising, all at a cost of some $10,000, paid for by contributors to a Republican president, not a Democratic write-in candidate. The president's campaign funds were also given to Democratic contenders Eugene McCarthy and Shirley Chisholm. Along this line, there was a project to finance the candidate for the Democratic nomination for governor, who was opposing former Governor George Wallace. This was to be financed by surplus funds from the 1968 campaign, which Mr. Haldeman testified that he, quote, requested or approved for funding support to a candidate for governor in Alabama, end quote. Mr. Haldeman also approved, quote, the funding of Donald Segretti, end quote. The story of Segretti and his henchmen illustrates more dramatically than anything else in the efforts of the White House in the 1972 election to subject the voting privilege of American citizens to gutter politics. Whether Segretti had any significant or measurable effect is not the question. It was an example, straight from the White House, of the worst in American politics. It included informers planted in opponents' campaigns, stink bombs unleashed against voters attending a campaign picnic, against volunteers in a telephone bank operation, and inside a campaign headquarters, a letter on a replica of Muskie stationery accusing Senators Jackson and Humphrey of sexual improprieties in the most vile language, flyers inviting voters to a non-existent open house at Muskie headquarters, a flyer advertising a free all-you-can-eat lunch with drinks at Humphrey headquarters, a small plane circling the Democratic convention advertising, quote, pot, peace, promiscuity, vote McGovern, end quote. Adverse press that forced cancellation of a Muskie fundraising dinner, printed cards with, quote, if you like Hitler, you'll love Wallace, vote for Muskie, end quote. Stink bombs thrown into a campaign headquarters, a forged letter on McCarthy stationery urging McCarthy delegates to switch to Humphrey, a letter on Yorty stationery blaming the McCarthy letters on Yorty, hired hecklers, pickets, and informers to disrupt, infiltrate, and spy on Senators Humphrey, Muskie, and Jackson, a false press release with the information that Muskie was using government-owned typewriters and federal employees not on leave of absence, a series of false anti-Muskie advertisements in the University of Miami campus newspaper, the local Cuban newspaper, and on the local Cuban radio station, insulting the Cuban people, a false press release on Muskie stationery with a vague stand on aid to Israel, which did not go over well in Miami Beach, a flyer claiming Muskie favored busing while sending his children to private schools, rats and birds released at a Muskie press conference, a naked woman to run in front of Muskie headquarters yelling, I love Muskie, a flyer falsely advertising the appearance of Lauren Green and Mrs. Martin Luther King at a Humphrey rally, hundreds of dollars worth of flowers, chicken, and pizzas delivered to Muskie headquarters, a set of invitations to Black Panthers, the Gay Liberation Front, the Hare Krishna movement, and African diplomats for a Muskie fundraising dinner, a chauffeur for the Muskie campaign, codenamed Ruby One, who would turn over documents being delivered so they could be surreptitiously photographed and eventually shown to Mr. Mitchell, a rented office near Muskie's headquarters to facilitate copying of documents, a group of infiltrators in Muskie headquarters in Milwaukee, Humphrey headquarters in Philadelphia, a government headquarters in Los Angeles, Washington, and Miami, a ploy to get campaign workers to drink beer and skip work, and an operation to switch phone bank call sheets so the same people would be called repeatedly or the wrong message would go to selected groups. This is not to mention similar operations by persons known as Sedan Chair 1 and Sedan Chair 2 and Ruby 2. It was nothing short of a massive operation to deprive the American voter of information about Democratic candidates for president. It was significant not so much as an attack on politicians, but as an attack on voters and their opportunity to cast a fully informed vote. Dirty tricks were not the only means used to influence the electoral process improperly. Misleading the voter by official conduct and statements was equally in evidence. This kept critical information hidden from voters when there was a legal obligation to disclose it, thereby preventing a proper judgment of the incumbent administration. The Watergate break-in was called a, quote, third-rate burglary at a time when the White House knew better, based on its briefings and discussions, including a discussion of executive clemency with the President in July 1972, end quote. Mr. MaryAnn testified that he even complained to Mr. Clark McGregor who had succeeded Mr. Mitchell as campaign manager, that statements being made regarding non-involvement of campaign personnel were untrue, and that he unsuccessfully attempted to brief McGregor about the tremendous exposure of certain people in the campaign. On August 29, 1972, the President assured the nation that an investigation by John Dean had cleared the White House of any involvement. This statement was made in spite of the fact that the President had received no report from Dean and never ever talked with Dean about Watergate. In mid-September 1972, the President discussed possibly unethical out-of-court contacts that had apparently taken place with the judge in one of the Watergate lawsuits, as part of a strategy to keep the process of justice from operating. Delay or obstruction of this process again ensured that voters would not have the legal record before them in November. In mid-October 1972, high-level staff meetings at the White House were convened to decide how to handle news reports about Segretti. Even though these participating knew or had access to the full Segretti story, the decision was made to issue tough denials, in what Mr. Richard Moore described as weasel words. The story was basically correct, yet it was denounced as, quote, hearsay, innuendo, and character assassination, end quote. No effort was made to tell the truth. The voters were kept in the dark. Perhaps this tactic was best summed in testimony by Mr. John Mitchell. He was interviewed by the FBI on July 5, 1972, and stated that all he knew was what he had read in the newspapers, despite testimony that he had been extensively briefed about Watergate by MaryAnn and LaRue. His explanation, quote, at that particular time we weren't volunteering any information, end quote. His reason, quote, the re-election of the president, this particular president, was uppermost in my mind without question, end quote. One man was thereby elevated above the fundamental principles of this nation. End of section 35. Recording by Greg Giordano. Newport Richey, Florida.
Section 36 of the Watergate Report, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kevin Vink. Final Report of the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, Volume 3. Chapter 11, Individual Views of Senators of the Select Committee, Part 9. 4. Transition from Fact to Opinion. At the conclusion of the fact-gathering phase of the committee's mandate, I met with Legislative Assistant A. Cyril Field and Assistant Minority Counsel H. William Schur to discuss what shape our report on Watergate should take. We settled upon the following woulds and wouldn'ts. 1. We would emphasize the known in order to impress upon the reader the importance of its implications rather than explode new facts of scandal. We were convinced White House strategy is geared to numbing America past concern by inundating America with one White House horror after another. 2. We would report within a framework of principles and institutions rather than people. 3. We would opine and editorialize, but separately from the factual presentation. 4. We would recommend remedial legislation. We wouldn't try and resolve conflicting testimony. We wouldn't make judgments on individual guilt or innocence. We wouldn't cite shaky material as proof. If what you've read up to now in these pages is not new, neither is it susceptible to argument. The indisputable ugliness of Watergate is of such scope as to categorize it as a sheer insanity, either for those who participated in it or have since defended it. I don't know, except as the courts have already passed judgment, who is guilty or who is innocent. But I do know that to accept the White House version of your Constitution, your government, and your politics is to counterfeit America. A. Understanding Watergate. All right, what to do with the raw data of Watergate? Unless positive understandings and actions emanate from this negative sequence, then it seems to me nobody really was caught breaking into Watergate. The gut question this summer is, what do Americans now know and what are they going to do about it? By way of dramatizing the need for a proper answer to that question, let me cite the following example. I recently received a critical letter which read, "Really, Senator, all is fair in love and war." American elections, war, members of another party, enemies, politics, fear. Is that the lesson America is taking home from the Watergate? Because if such is the case, then a whole new era in American politics will have dawned, and Gordon Liddy will be recognized not as peculiar, but as a visionary. Also at such time, we of the Select Committee would have failed. Though a year has gone by between the time of the Senate Watergate hearings and this senator's Watergate conclusions, it is a matter of constitutional life and death that the American people make a connection between those two events. What about the Constitution? Is it up to our times? Certainly it never before has obtained such visibility. But how about acceptance? 1. The Constitution. Later in this section, I intend to editorialize on the abuses to our governmental and political institutions. However, the pivotal struggle of Watergate is one between men who play for the moment and look upon the Constitution as a 4th of July interruption to their own charter, and men who play for tomorrow and understand it to be the force that has given America success beyond America's natural abilities for success. Never first in population, landmass, or natural resources, why have we attained a national greatness and personal affluence beyond that achieved by any country or people? Because we perjured? Because dissent was disloyalty? Because justice was political? Because our concern was developing rear? Because we burgled? Because we thought the worst of each other? Or because all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Or because Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances? Or because the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated? Or because no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law? Or because in all criminal prosecutions the accused shall enjoy the right to be confronted with the witnesses against him, to have compulsory process for obtaining witnesses in his favor? Or because the President shall take the following oath: I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States, and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. I get none of the everybody's doing it or transcripts spirit in any of those words. The constitutional history of Watergate to this date has been that of a president and his ministers who de facto have tried to yes but most sections of the Constitution. I feel Article 5 to be preferable to administration amending methods. Several years ago, many Americans were willing to silently tolerate illegal government activity against militants, terrorists, or subversives as an expeditious way to circumvent the precise process of our justice system. Though quick, it also proved to be only a short step to using such illegal tactics against any dissenting American. The result was we almost lost America, not to subversives, terrorists, or extremists of the streets, but to subversives, terrorists, and extremists of the White House. That is why there can be no acquiescence now to a few yes buts to the Constitution. To do so would be just as big a cop-out as those who espouse violence in the name of peace. American constitutional democracy is not the tidiest, most orderly, most efficient, most expeditious, quietest political system on earth. It is in fact raucous, off in 1,000 directions of concern, involved with millions of individuals rather than a mass, revolutionary and querulous. But what some deem as flaws are precisely its genius. For those who have made it, it's a pain. For those who haven't, it rebutes predestination. Our greatness will always be in direct proportion to our freedoms. Yes, that includes the freedom to be wrong. Free spirits, not measured freedom, has been the promise of the Constitution. We can have peace in Vietnam, on campus, and in the neighborhood without forfeiting that promise, and no man or group of men deserve leadership if they would put the nation to such a choice. 2. Government. The offices of government in this nation are complex and awesomely powerful, even if engaged on legal pursuits. It's not an exaggeration to state that a U.S. Senator needs every bit of his clout to move effectively within the bureaucratic maze. Insofar as the 99.9% of Americans who are not presidents, congressmen, or senators If anything goes wrong with either end of the govern-government equation, the mismatch of the century ensues. And that's so, even though the slip-up is innocently legal. Fully 50% of a senator's time and staff are devoted to resolving the innocently legal slip-ups between his constituents and their government. And I'm sure those who speak up are no more than 5% of those being wronged. What then if agencies and officers of the U.S. government become involved not in innocently legal mistakes, but purposefully illegal vengeance? In light of the facts already presented, the greatest danger of this section is for me not to over-editorialize the case so as to engender disbelief. Of those who read this report, 99% of them know senators, congressmen, successful lawyers, and other powerful persons. But America is not supposed to be about the powerful, rather the frail. And they're the ones who will eventually suffer the most if the White House record on using the government agencies politically to bring about conformity is allowed to go unchallenged. The enemies list, revealed in the dialogue I had with John Dean, has received much hoopla. But aside from the fact that today it has become a badge of honor, have you ever thought what it feels like to be an American and have the highest office in the land look upon you as an enemy? To be spied on, to be investigated, to be harassed, to be reviled by your own country? It may be a badge of honor when revealed, but it's frighteningly disheartening while it's going on, and no one believes that these things are happening in America. Oh yes, I've heard the excuses for the illegal use of the federal law enforcement intelligence community: national security, domestic security, terrorists, law and order, subversives, militants. But let me put the White House record in the proper factual context. No administration within my lifetime has had a worse record of convictions in relation to indictments than the Nixon administration. Why? Because it tried to achieve law and order by lawlessness. It was the courts that said no, not the Justice Department. In the matter of the Special Compliance Division of the IRS and their keeping tabs on militants, subversives, terrorists, ideological, and other organizations, it is fact that in all of the IRS files that came into White House possession, there is not one militant, subversive, terrorist individual or organization. That is the lesson of a White House gone ape. Our lesson is that you can't protect the rights of anyone unless you protect the rights of everyone. The differences between myself and this administration on Watergate are not philosophical, political, historical, personal, or regional. They are constitutional, pure and simple. A better summation of our differences could not be found than the surreptitious entry language of the 1970 Spy Houston Sullivan Plan, and again in the words of the President on September 15, 1972. Use of this technique is clearly illegal. It amounts to burglary. It is also highly risky and could result in great embarrassment if exposed. However, it is also the most fruitful tool and can produce the type of intelligence which cannot be obtained in any other fashion. You can't have that and democracy. I want the most comprehensive notes on all those who tried to do us in. They didn't have to do it. They are asking for it, and they are going to get it. We have not used the power in this first 4 years, as you know. We have not used the Bureau, FBI, and we have not used justice. But things are going to change now, and they are either going to do it right or go. You can't have that and democracy. Remember what Pat Gray said? I said earlier in the game that I thought that Watergate would tarnish everyone with whom it came in contact, and I am no exception. I had a responsibility not to permit myself to be used, not to permit myself to be deceived, and I failed in that responsibility, and I have never failed in anything that I have undertaken until this point in time, and it hurts. The Congress and the American people, with more facts in hand than Pat Gray ever had, have an even greater responsibility not to be used or deceived in this matter of abuses to our governmental agencies and political processes. Because most elected officials or citizens haven't had the FBI, IRS, CIA, MI, SS, Justice Department, Defense Department, Commerce Department, Fat Jack, or Tony Ulasewicz on their tail does not mean the abuses of Watergate passed them by. It only means that if they don't speak out now, they've got no complaint later. A little less spectating Watergate and a little more speaking out is very much in order. Admittedly, to speak out is tough, just as the Bill of Rights and democracy is tough. but speaking out is a patriotism far better suited to 1974 than 1972's wearing of flag lapel pins by White House and CREP employees while they advocated burglary, wiretapping, committed perjury, politicized justice, impugned the patriotism of those who disagreed with them, and threw due process in the shredder. Americans of all generations have suffered and died at their best because they were uncompromising in the idealism they wished for their country. Who of this generation, then, wants to declare a lesser truth for America? It is the answer we give to that question which matters. It will decide America. 3. Politics. In November 1962, I was elected to my first public office, state representative to the General Assembly in Hartford, Connecticut. Now, some 12 years and 8 elections later, I am rounding out my first term in the U.S. Senate, a boyhood dream come true. Yes, it's time-consuming and rough on the family life. To that extent, it's tough. But each dawn, for 12 years, has me looking forward to the day. Politics is a clean business with dedicated people. The terms 9 to 5 and 5-day week are seldom heard. The winning politician is in the business of love and not hate. The average politician takes the cost of serving out of his pocket and not the public's taxes. These things need saying to challenge the end justifies the mean image, the everybody's doing it image that the White House knowingly and a few ignoramuses unwittingly would give politics. We're replete with failings personally, as I, my staff, and my family know all too well. But with the public trust given us by our constituencies, we'd no more see that in the mud than the American flag. Can I prove the above? Sure, look at your America as I've asked the people of Connecticut to look at their state. The truth of American politics is in the schools of this country, not a wiretap. In the hospitals, not a burglary. In the housing projects, not a scurrilous letter. In the parks, not in hush money. In facilities for the retarded, not in spying. In people who would volunteer in 1,000 ways, not in dirty tricksters. In politicians who reach for the weak first, the strong second, not in hatchetmen. In short, dirt does not conceive so much tangible excellence as we have in our country. The truth of America is not in the deeds of men and women at their worst, but rather at their best. Government with its politicians and the people are not apart in a democracy. They are one. And so it is we will not get any better ethics or more idealism in the Oval Office or on the Senate floor than we do in the voting booths. Watergate was conceived in an ignorant apathy of the electorate and was executed in semi-conscious apathy. Its greatest danger is that it will be forgotten in an apathy of total knowledge. That kind of voting booth acquittal means that American politics has officially joined the administration on the dark side of the manhole. Thank you, no. B. People and power. Watergate is not the story of one powerful man. It is a story of people. Though my efforts have been directed towards the principles and institutions of this nation, I am well aware that their existence or disappearance reflects human behavior. It is no source of pride to me as an American that the coinage of responsibility has been in inverse measure to rank and power. I was taught early on, first by my dad and then by the U.S. Army, that rank has its privileges because rank has its responsibilities. Yet in the case of this president, I've heard the word privilege used over and over again as a dodge of responsibility. The word Stonewall has been used to describe the president's defense. Believe me, it has been, and continues to be, a human wall. C. Republicans. Obviously, this has been rough duty in a Republican sense. However, from the outset, I've operated on the basis that the best investigation was the best politics. I couldn't change the facts. I couldn't silence those who knew the facts. All I could do was make sure that a Republican spoke the facts, if not before, then simultaneously with a Democrat. On page 103 of the transcripts, President Richard Nixon is talking to John Dean. I don't know what we can do. The people who are most disturbed about this, unintelligible, are the adjective-deleted Republicans. A lot of these congressmen, financial contributors, etc. are highly moral. The Democrats are just sort of saying, expletive-deleted, fun and games. Richard Nixon understood the strong base of integrity that is a Republican heritage. Because he rejected it is then no reason for any Republican to do so now. Because the Republican National Committee and its chairman, Senator Robert Dole of Kansas, wherein the traditional Republican mold of decency and honesty is exactly the why of a committee to re-elect the president. At an executive session of the Select Committee held on Wednesday, June 19, 1974, I inquired of the staff and the committee whether after 1 year of investigation there was evidence of wrongdoing by either the RNC or Senator Dole. The answer was a clear-cut no in both instances. Republicans who now state that everybody does it dishonor the men and women of their own official party organization and Bob Dole, who didn't do it and wouldn't have done it. One last comment. The record establishes that 1. The White House took a dive on the congressional races of 1972 insofar as many Republican candidates were concerned. 2. Democratic candidates were actively assisted in some instances. 3. The White House expended considerable resources and energies zapping Republican senators and congressmen. 4. The Justice Department was consulted as to how to keep a Republican off the Florida primary ballot. Along with a will to pursue the truth, I would hope that the will to win for the Republican Party is slightly stronger and fairer in its next titular head. D. Tomorrow. No, this won't be the Watergate to end all Watergates. Other men will tape the doors of America in other times. Whether they succeed will be a matter of spirit, for then, as now, the state of our spirit will determine the state of this union. Recommendations. The necessary legislative and/or constitutional steps should be initiated to 1. Make all forms of domestic electronic surveillance, including wiretapping, illegal. 2. Have the office of Attorney General of the United States be an elected office. 3. Make all nominations for federal elective office by direct primary, with unaffiliated voters free to participate in the party primary of their choice. 4. Establish a joint congressional committee with complete investigative powers and rotating membership to monitor domestic intelligence gathering and law enforcement activities throughout the executive branch and be able, under appropriate safeguards, to obtain and provide access to relevant materials requested by any member of Congress. Similar oversight functions now held by congressional committees should be transferred to the Joint Committee. 5. Grant the Supreme Court original jurisdiction over disputes as to any privilege asserted by the President with respect to the Congress or federal law enforcement agencies, thereby making the Supreme Court the first and final arbiter of the issue. 6. Subject senior White House staff personnel to confirmation by the Senate. 7. Prohibit White House staff from making recommendations, inquiries, or exchanging classified information with any department or agency as to any case, action, or funding except upon written authority of the President, which authority shall be immediately transmitted to the appropriate congressional committee along with a description of each instance in which the authority is used. 8. Draft a code of candidate responsibility with appropriate disciplinary rules and grievance procedures to be enforced through a federal elections commission. 9. Provide for accredited campaign representatives exchanged by opponents for nomination or election to federal office to be accorded the privileges of travel, interviews, and news releases granted to accredited press representatives in general. 10. Require federal candidates and office holders to fully disclose all sources of income and assets or liabilities over $1,500 to be submitted by February 15th of each year for the calendar year preceding for publication in the Congressional Record. This to supersede any present statutes relative to congressional financial disclosure. 11. Require campaigns for the presidency after a nominee is selected to be run by the party of the candidate. 12. Require that campaigns for nomination or election to federal office be conducted between the first Tuesday of September and the first Tuesday of November. 13. Designate Election Day as a federal holiday in order that the voting franchise not be restricted by competing concerns about jobs. 14. Require that candidates for federal elective office report all collections and expenditures 2 weeks before Election Day with no collections thereafter. 15. Prohibit candidates for federal elective office from accepting cash contributions over $50 or spending more than $10,000 in personal funds. 16. Restrict candidates for federal elective office to only one campaign committee. 17. open all congressional hearings and sessions to the public, except with respect to national security, proprietary information, or personally defamatory matters. The present rule, leaving such open sessions up to each committee's discretion, should be made mandatory and uniform. End of Section 36.
Section 37 of the Watergate Report, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Giordano. Final report of the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities. Volume 3. Resolutions pertaining to the Select Committee. 93rd Congress, First Session. Senate Resolution 60. In the Senate of the United States, February 5, 1973, Mr. Ervin, for himself, and Mr. Mansfield, submitted the following resolution, which was ordered to be placed on the calendar. February 7, 1973. Considered, amended, and agreed to. Omit the part struck through and insert the part printed in italic. Resolution. To establish a select committee of the Senate to conduct an investigation and study of the extent, if any, to which illegal, improper, or unethical activities were engaged in by any persons acting individually or in combination with others in the presidential election of 1972, or any campaign, canvass, or other activity related to it. Resolved, Section 1, A, that there is hereby established a select committee of the Senate, which may be called, for convenience of expression, the Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, to conduct an investigation and study of the extent, if any, to which illegal, improper, or unethical activities were engaged in by any persons acting either individually or in combination with others in the presidential election of 1972, or in any related campaign or canvass conducted by or in behalf of any person seeking nomination or election as the candidate of any political party for the office of President of the United States in such election, and to determine whether in its judgment any occurrences which may be revealed by the investigation and study indicate the necessity or desirability of the enactment of new congressional legislation to safeguard the electoral process by which the President of the United States is chosen. B. The Select Committee created by this resolution shall consist of 7 members of the Senate, 4 of whom shall be appointed by the President of the Senate from the majority members of the Senate upon the recommendation of the majority leader of the Senate, and 3 of whom shall be appointed by the President of the Senate from the minority members of the Senate upon the recommendation of the minority leader of the Senate. For the purposes of paragraph 6 of Rule 25 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, service of a senator as a member, chairman, or vice chairman of the Select Committee shall not be taken into account. C. The Select Committee shall select a chairman and vice chairman from among its members and adopt rules of procedure to govern its proceedings. The vice chairman shall preside over meetings of the Select Committee during the absence of the chairman, and discharge such other responsibilities as may be assigned to him by the Select Committee or the chairman. Vacancies in the membership of the Select Committee shall not affect the authority of the remaining members to execute the functions of the Select Committee, and shall be filled in the same manner as original appointments to it are made. D. A majority of the members of the Select Committee shall constitute a quorum for the transaction of business, but the Select Committee may fix a lesser number as a quorum for the purpose of taking testimony or depositions. Section 2. That the Select Committee is authorized and directed to do everything necessary or appropriate to make the investigation and study specified in Section 1A, without abridging or limiting in any way the authority conferred upon the Select Committee by the preceding sentence. The Senate further expressly authorizes and directs the Select Committee to make a complete investigation and study of the activities of any and all persons or groups of persons or organizations of any kind which have any tendency to reveal the full facts in respect to the following matters or questions. 1. The breaking, entering, and bugging of the headquarters or offices of the Democratic National Committee in the Watergate building in Washington, District of Columbia. 2. The monitoring by bugging, eavesdropping, wiretapping, or other surreptitious means of conversations or communications occurring in whole or in part in the headquarters or offices of the Democratic National Committee in the Watergate building in Washington, District of Columbia. 3. Whether or not any printed or typed or written document or paper or other material was surreptitiously removed from the headquarters or offices of the Democratic National Committee in the Watergate building in Washington, District of Columbia, and thereafter copied or reproduced by photography or any other means for the information of any person or political committee or organization. 4. The preparing, transmitting, or receiving by any person for himself or any political committee or any organization of any report or information concerning the activities mentioned in subdivision 1, 2, or 3 of this section and the information contained in any such report. 5. Whether any persons, acting individually or in combination with others, planned the activities mentioned in subdivision 1, 2, 3, or 4 of this section, or employed any of the participants in such activities to participate in them, or made any payments or promises of payments of money or other things of value to the participants in such activities or their families for their activities, or for concealing the truth in respect to them or any of the persons having any connection with them or their activities, and, if so, the source of the moneys used in such payments, and the identities and motives of the persons planning such activities or employing the participants in them. 6. Whether any persons participating in any of the activities mentioned in subdivision 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 of this section have been induced by bribery, coercion, threats, or any other means whatsoever to plead guilty to the charges preferred against them in the District Court of the District of Columbia, or to conceal or fail to reveal any knowledge of any of the activities mentioned in subdivision 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 of this section, and, if so, the identities of the persons inducing them to do such things, and the identities of any other persons or any committees or organizations for whom they acted. 7. Any efforts to disrupt, hinder, impede, or sabotage in any way any campaign, canvass, or activity conducted by or in behalf of any person seeking nomination or election as the candidate of any political party for the office of President of the United States in 1972 by infiltrating any political committee or organization or headquarters or offices or home or whereabouts of the person seeking such nomination or election, or of any person aiding him in so doing, or by bugging or eavesdropping or wiretapping the conversations, communications, plans, headquarters, offices, home, or whereabouts of the person seeking such nomination or election, or of any other person assisting him in so doing, or by exercising surveillance over the person seeking such nomination or election, or of any person assisting him in so doing, or by reporting to any other person or to any political committee or organization any information obtained by such infiltration, eavesdropping, bugging, wiretapping, or surveillance. 8. Whether any person acting individually or in combination with others, or political committee or organization induced any of the activities mentioned in Subdivision 7 of this section, or paid any of the participants in any such activities for their services, and if so, the identities of such persons or committee or organization, and the source of the funds used by them to procure or finance such activities. 9. Any fabrication, dissemination, or publication of any false charges or other false information having the purpose of discrediting any person seeking nomination or election as the candidate of any political party to the office of President of the United States in 1972. 10. The planning of any of the activities mentioned in Subdivision 7, 8, or 9 of this section, the employing of the participants in such activities, and the source of any moneys or things of value which may have been given or promised to the participants in such activities for their services, and the identities of any persons or committees or organizations which may have been involved in any way in the planning, procuring, and financing of such activities. 11. Any transactions or circumstances relating to the source, the control, the transmission, the transfer, the deposit, the storage, the concealment, the expenditure or use in the United States or in any other country of any moneys or other things of value collected or received for actual or pretended use in the presidential election of 1972 or in any related campaign or canvass or activities preceding or accompanying such election by any person, group of persons, committee, or organization of any kind acting or professing to act in behalf of any national political party, or in support of, or in opposition to, any person seeking nomination or election to the office of President of the United States in 1972. 12. Compliance or noncompliance with any act of Congress requiring the reporting of the receipt or disbursement or use of any moneys or other things of value mentioned in Subdivision 11 of this section. 13. Whether any of the moneys or things of value mentioned in Subdivision 11 of this section were placed in any secret fund or place of storage for use in financing any activity which was sought to be concealed from the public, and, if so, what disbursement or expenditure was made of such secret fund, and the identities of any person or group of persons, or committee, or organization having any control over such secret fund, or the disbursement or expenditure of the same. 14. Whether any books, checks, canceled checks, communications, correspondence, documents, papers, physical evidence, records, recordings, tapes, or materials relating to any of the matters or questions the Select Committee is authorized and directed to investigate and study have been concealed, suppressed, or destroyed by any persons acting individually or in combination with others, and, if so, the identities and motives of any such persons or groups of persons. 15. Any other activities, circumstances, materials, or transactions having a tendency to prove or disprove that persons acting either individually or in combination with others engaged in any illegal, improper, or unethical activities in connection with the presidential election of 1972, or any campaign, canvass, or activity related to such election. 16. Whether any of the existing laws of the United States are inadequate, either in their provisions or manner of enforcement, to safeguard the integrity or purity of the process by which presidents are chosen. Section 3. A. To enable a select committee to make the investigation and study authorized and directed by this resolution, the Senate hereby empowers the Select Committee, as an agency of the Senate, 1. To employ and fix the compensation of such clerical, investigatory, legal, technical, and other assistance as it deems necessary or appropriate. 2. To sit and act at any time or place during sessions, recesses, and adjournment periods of the Senate. 3. To hold hearings for taking testimony on oath or to receive documentary or physical evidence relating to the matters and questions it is authorized to investigate or study. 4. To require by subpoena or otherwise the attendance as witnesses of any persons who the Select Committee believes have knowledge or information concerning any of the matters or questions it is authorized to investigate and study. 5. To require by subpoena or order any department, agency, officer, or employee of the executive branch of the United States government, or any private person, firm, or corporation, or any officer or former officer or employee of any political committee or organization, to produce for its consideration or for use as evidence in its investigation and study any books, checks, canceled checks, correspondence, communications, document, papers, physical evidence, records, recordings, tapes, or materials relating to any of the matters or questions it is authorized to investigate and study which they or any of them may have in their custody or under their control. 6. To make to the Senate any recommendations it deems appropriate in respect to the willful failure or refusal of any person to appear before it in obedience to a subpoena or order, or in respect to the willful failure or refusal of any person to answer questions or give testimony in his character as a witness during his appearance before it, or in respect to the willful failure or refusal of any officer or employee of the executive branch of the United States government, or any person, firm, or corporation, or any officer or former officer or employee of any political committee or organization, to produce before the committee any books, checks, canceled checks, correspondence, communications, document, financial records, papers, physical evidence, records, recordings, tapes, or materials in obedience to any subpoena or order. 7. To take depositions and other testimony on oath anywhere within the United States or in any other country. 8. To procure the temporary or intermittent services of individual consultants or organizations thereof in the same manner and under the same conditions as a standing committee of the Senate may procure such services under Section 202I of the Legislative Reorganization Act of 1946. 9. To use on a reimbursable basis, with the prior consent of the government department or agency concerned, and the Committee on Rules and Administration, the services of personnel of any such department or agency. 10. To use on a reimbursable basis or otherwise, with the prior consent of the chairman of any other of the Senate committees, or the chairman of any subcommittee of any committee of the staffs of such other Senate committees, or any subcommittees of such other Senate committees, whenever the Select Committee or its chairman deems that such action is necessary or appropriate to enable the Select Committee to make the investigation and study authorized and directed by this resolution. 11. To have access, through the agency of any member of the Select Committee, Chief Majority Counsel, Minority Counsel, or any of its investigatory assistants jointly designated by the Chairman and the ranking minority member to any data, evidence, information, report, analysis, or document, or papers relating to any of the matters or questions which it is authorized and directed to investigate and study in the custody or under the control of any department, agency, officer, or employee of the executive branch of the United States government, having the power under the laws of the United States to investigate any alleged criminal activities or to prosecute persons charged with crimes against the United States, which will aid the Select Committee to prepare for or conduct the investigation and study authorized and directed by this resolution, and 12. To expand to the extent it determines necessary or appropriate any monies made available to it by the Senate to perform the duties and exercise the powers conferred upon it by this resolution, and to make the investigation and study it is authorized by this resolution to make. B. Subpoenas may be issued by the Select Committee, acting through the Chairman or any other member designated by him, and may be served by any person designated by such Chairman or other member anywhere within the borders of the United States. The Chairman of the Select Committee, or any other member thereof, is hereby authorized to administer oaths to any witnesses appearing before the committee. C. In preparing for or conducting the investigation and study authorized and directed by this resolution, the Select Committee shall be empowered to exercise the powers conferred upon committees of the Senate by Section 6002 of Title 18 of the United States Code, or any other act of Congress regulating the granting of immunity to witnesses. Section 4. The Select Committee shall have authority to recommend the enactment of any new congressional legislation which its investigation considers it is necessary or desirable to safeguard the electoral process by which the President of the United States is chosen. Section 5. The Select Committee shall make a final report of the results of the investigation and study conducted by it pursuant to this resolution, together with its findings and its recommendations as to new congressional legislation it deems necessary or desirable, to the Senate at the earliest practicable date, but no later than February 28, 1974. The Select Committee may also submit to the Senate such interim reports as it considers appropriate. After submission of its final report, the Select Committee shall have 3 calendar months to close its affairs, and on the expiration of such 3 calendar months shall cease to exist. Section 6. The expenses of the Select Committee through February 28, 1974, under this resolution shall not exceed $500,000, of which amount not to exceed $25,000 shall be available for the procurement of the services of individual consultants or organizations thereof. Such expenses shall be paid from the contingent fund of the Senate upon vouchers approved by the Chairman of the Select Committee. The minority members of the Select Committee shall have 1/3 of the professional staff of the Select Committee, including a minority counsel, and such part of the clerical staff as may be adequate. 93rd Congress, First Session. Senate Resolution 194. In the Senate of the United States, November 2, 1973. Mr. Ervin for himself, Mr. Baker, Mr. Gurney, Mr. Inouye, Mr. Montoya, Mr. Talmadge, and Mr. Weicker submitted the following resolution, which was ordered to be placed on the calendar, November 7, 1973, considered and agreed to. Resolution relating to Senate Resolution 60. Resolved that Section 1, by Senate Resolution 60, 93rd Congress, First Session, 1973, Section 3A.5, the Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities was and is empowered to issue subpoenas for documents, tapes, and other material to any officer of the executive branch of the United States government, in view of the fact that the President of the United States is, as recognized by Senate Resolution 60, an officer of the United States, and was a candidate for the office of President in 1972, and is therefore a person whose activities the Select Committee is authorized by Senate Resolution 60 to investigate. It is the sense of the Senate that the Select Committee's issuance on July 23, 1973, of 2 subpoenas duces tecum to the President for the production of tapes and other materials was and is fully authorized by Senate Resolution 60. Moreover, the Senate hereby approves and ratifies the committee's issuance of those subpoenas. Section 2. On August 9, 1973, the Select Committee and its members instituted suit against the President of the United States in the United States District Court for the District of Columbia to achieve compliance with the two subpoenas referenced in Section 1 above. And since that time, and both the District Court and the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit have actively pursued this litigation. It is the sense of the Senate that the initiation and pursuit of this litigation by the Select Committee and its members was and is fully authorized by applicable custom and law, including the provisions of Senate Resolution 262, 70th Congress, First Session, 1928. In view of the entirely discretionary provisions of Sections 3A, 6 of Senate Resolution 60, it is further the sense of the Senate that the initiation of the lawsuit did not require the prior approval of the Senate. Moreover, the Senate hereby approves and ratifies the actions of the Select Committee in instituting and pursuing the aforesaid litigation. Section 3. The Select Committee and its members, by issuing subpoenas to the President and instituting and pursuing litigation to achieve compliance with those subpoenas, were and are acting to determine the extent of possible illegal, improper, or unethical conduct in connection with the presidential campaign and election of 1972 by officers or employees of the executive branch of the United States government or other persons. It is the sense of the Senate that, in so doing, the Select Committee and its members were and are engaged in the furtherance of valid legislative purposes, to wit, a determination of the need for and scope of corrective legislation to safeguard the processes by which the President of the United States is elected, and, in that connection, the informing of the public of the extent of illegal, improper, or unethical activities that occurred in connection with the presidential campaign and election of 1972, and the involvement of officers or employees of the executive branch, or others therein. It is further the sense of the Senate that the materials sought by the committee's subpoenas are of vital importance in determining the extent of such involvement and in determining the need for and scope of corrective legislation. 93rd Congress, First Session, Senate Resolution 132. In the Senate of the United States, June 25, 1973. Mr. Ervin, for himself, and Mr. Baker, submitted the following resolution, which was considered and agreed to. Resolution: to increase the sums allotted to the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities for the expenses of conducting the investigation and study authorized and directed by Senate Resolution 60, which was adopted on February 7, 1973. Resolved, Section 1, that the first sentence of Section 6 of Senate Resolution 60, which was adopted on February 7, 1973, is hereby changed to read as follows. The expenses of the Select Committee through February 28, 1974, under this resolution, shall not exceed $1 million, of which amount not to exceed $40,000 shall be available for the procurement of the services of individual consultants or organizations thereof. 93rd Congress, Second Session, Senate Resolution 327. In the Senate of the United States, May 20, 1974. Mr. Ervin, for himself, and Mr. Baker, submitted the following resolution, which was ordered to be placed on the calendar, May 21, 1974, considered and agreed to. Resolution: to extend the time of the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities for making its final report to the Senate and for prosecuting its judicial action against the President for certain taped recordings. Resolved, that Section 5 of Senate Resolution 60, which was adopted February 7, 1973, is hereby amended to read as follows. The Select Committee shall make a final report of the results of the investigation and study conducted by it pursuant to this resolution, together with its findings and such legislative proposals as it deems necessary or desirable, to the Senate at the earliest practicable date, but no later than June 30th, 1974. The Select Committee may also submit to the Senate such interim reports as it considers appropriate. After submission of its final report, the Select Committee shall have 3 calendar months to close its affairs, and on the expiration of such 3 calendar months shall cease to exist, provided, however, that in case the judicial action brought by the Select Committee against the President to obtain specified taped recordings of conversations in which the President and his former aide, John W. Dean, participated is not fully adjudicated before the expiration of such 3 calendar months, the Select Committee shall continue in existence thereafter until 30 days subsequent to the occurrence of one of these alternative events, namely, the judicial action is finally adjudicated adversely to the Select Committee, or the specified taped recordings are actually received by the Select Committee pursuant to the final adjudication of such judicial action or otherwise. In case the last event occurs, the Select Committee is empowered to report to the Senate an addendum to its final report, setting forth findings and legislative recommendations based on what the taped recordings disclose. End of Section 37. Recording by Greg Giordano, Newport Richey, Florida. End of Final Report of the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, Volume 3.